what are the best exercises to build your lower back without damaging it? That's what we're going to look at in this tutorial. We're going to start it by looking at a common approach that isn't as effective, and then we're going to look at the end of this tutorial a more effective approach that will build the low back without damaging it. If you want to build your low back strength and endurance, please do hit the link in the description below and go through to my How to Build Low Back Strength and Endurance online 12-week program, where you'll be able to build the low back strength and endurance using exercises that you're going to see in this tutorial and for the reasons I'm going to be laying out. Firstly, what's the common approach that people use to build their low back strength and endurance? Well, as you can see on the screen, you've got in the first image, you've got a back extension type of movement, which takes the low back through a full flexion and extension cycle. And then you've got an exercise which is next to it, which is the Jefferson curl, which I would normally, if I was doing the Jefferson curl properly, I would have weights in my hand. So I'm not only flexing and extending my low back, I'm also loading that, which is the injury mechanism for disc herniations, for disc bulges, for damaged vertebra, so on and so forth. So we want to start moving away from this type of approach. Now, there are genetic factors which will mean people will sort of move along that injury mechanism quicker, and there are genetic factors which will slow other people down. There are voices out there that will say you need to go through these full ranges of movement to strengthen it, and from a bodybuilding type of perspective, which has used joint movement, i.e. like a bicep, when you curl and so you flex and extend the elbow, you sort of flex the bicep muscle and then you extend the bicep muscle. If you use that type of idea, then you can understand their logic. The unfortunate thing is low back muscles aren't built that way, and I'm going to describe that when I talk about the primary function of the low back muscles. But first, it increases anterior posterior shear forces. So when you go through that flexion extension cycle, you get an anterior shear, which is where the vertebra wants to fall off the front, and you get a posterior shear force where it wants to fall off the back. So when you go through those cycles, that's what you're creating. You're creating those forces which are pushing and pulling on the vertebra. Now, that doesn't mean if you do one back extension that your back is going to break and that you're going to have some sort of injury to your lower back. It doesn't work like that. It happens over months and it happens over years. They build up, then you go and lift a box up off the floor and your back goes. It wasn't that one moment where you pick that box up off the floor. It was the years prior to that that built up and created that back problem. So we have to think about it in a more accumulative way rather than a one moment type of injury. It increases the delamination of the intervertebral discs, which is essentially the mechanism for a disc bulge or a disc herniation. So it can create that type of injury as well. Then you have knock-on effects of spondylolisthesis, which can sort of happen off the back of all of that as well. And then the final one, you've got reduces primary function of the back muscles. And I've included this other image of the spine with particular emphasis on the longissimus muscle. Now, the longissimus muscle anchors itself on the rib cage. So that's where it's held. What it then does is sort of moves off the ribs, goes onto the lower back and into the lumbodorsal fascia. Now, most of the contractile part of that muscle is on the rib cage. So it anchors on. So when you contract it, it anchors on the rib cage and supports and holds the lower back. It's not necessarily there designed to extend. It can extend, so don't sort of throw that back at me. It can do that. I'm just saying it's not its primary function. Its primary function is to statically contract and hold the lumbar vertebra in place. Because what is known is that when you flex the lumbar spine, it increases anterior shear forces. When you don't have the neutral spine, you don't have the posterior shear force to pull it back and neutralize it. When you have the neutral spine, the muscles in the lumbodorsal fascia that contracts, pulls the lumbodorsal fascia tight, creates posterior shear forces and neutralizes the anterior shear forces. So by maintaining that posture, you're neutralizing potential damaging forces and holding everything in place. You're also getting the benefit of not damaging the discs because they get damaged by flexion extension cycles. Now, if we add the next layer on, if we load those, so if we are lifting heavy weights or even moderate weights, then it speeds up that whole process and makes the process happen faster. So if we are doing lots of body weight stuff, it's not going to be as bad as when we're doing lots of lifting 100 kilo barbells off the floor, for example. So we have to understand that movement can be a problem. Now what I'm not saying is that you shouldn't move your spine, it's just there's a time and a place for it. And there's also a time and a place not to move your spine. So we want to be able to maintain that posture, neutralize the forces and minimize any risk of damage happening to it. So that sort of is a brief overview of the common approach. What we'll now look at is a more effective approach. And that approach is highlighted by these 3 exercises. Now, again, these aren't the only exercises. They do feature in the 12-week online program, but we do build through them. And essentially we're looking at a bridge, a side plank and a bird dog. So what we've got posterior musculature, we've got lateral musculature, and we've got rotational stability. Essentially the rotational stability is like an anti-rotation because we want to maintain in the bird dog level hips and shoulders. So we're not rotating, we are creating that rotational stability by maintaining level hips and shoulders. Now, what are these exercises doing? They're not necessarily working low back muscles. You've got the posterior muscles of the upper back working in the bird dog. You've got posterior muscles low underneath the low back in the glutes. And you've got the lateral musculature, which will also get the QL, which is a kind of low back muscle, but that's the only one. So what's happening here? Well, what we're doing is we're building a whole system around the lower back. And what we're then able to do, as I mentioned with the lumbodorsal fascia or the thoracolumbar fascia, is we're able to pull that taut, and that's going to neutralize a lot of the forces that potentially will go into the spine. What we're then able to do is distribute load around, because the bridge activates the glutes, which pulls on the bottom 2 portions of the thoracolumbar fascia. You've got the bird dog, which activates, or you can activate the lats with it, which will pull the top portion of it. So essentially you're pulling taut that area, which is then giving you a more stable area. So by building muscles around the low back, not necessarily of the low back, it's going to be that much more effective as an approach to building the lower back. We then can add in the side plank because you are going to get QL, longissimus iliocostalis on the side. You'll also get glute medius, glute minimus of the hip as well. So again, we're looking at that whole system around the lower back that we're able to build up, that we're able to stabilize the lumbar spine, and that's what's then going to build the strength and endurance of the lower back, because we're not putting unnecessary load through there. We are loading the spine, we are building capacity of the spine and the muscles of the lower back, but we're doing it as a greater system, using the hips, using the upper back, and using the lateral aspects of the core to be able to do that. And that's why it's a much more effective approach, because we're not just trying to isolate muscles of the lower back. We are trying to involve the whole system, and the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, if you've ever heard that saying. That is what the core is all about. It's about working as one unit rather than lots of individual muscles, and that's how we need to think about building it, and that's why this is a more effective approach for building low back strength and endurance. And then you can start including greater exercises like loading a deadlift or a squat or a press or a pull or things like that, but we need to start here to get that foundation in place. Thank you for watching. If you've liked the content, please do hit the like button. If you've learned something new, hit the thanks button. If you've got a comment or a question, please do leave it below. If you want to watch more tutorials like this, please do hit the subscribe button and the bell icon.